So we've just had a short introduction to polarizing as conflict behavior, as a response to threat, that righteous certainty about identity is what characterizes polarizing conflict behavior. We've talked about the shift between role and identity, where role is what situates us in relation to others, and identity is a sense of significance or valuing that gets attributed to identity markers like the color of our skin or my gender. So as a woman or as white, there's valuing that's connected with that, that has that becomes a sense of self or a sense of identity, and it can also be through our role. And so that the righteous certainty about others' identities also helps to then fuse my own sense of identity and my own righteous certainty. And so the path forward is to be able to, with curiosity, engage in wondering about what's the threat and why that defense with myself. What is it about the threat that makes righteous certainty my best defense, or in relation to others? And it's through that process of activating our own curiosity that we can engage more authentically with others in their polarizing behaviors, and not meet polarization with polarization. So, are there any other thoughts or questions about that? Responses, add-ons, digesting? That's great. If there's still that kind of quiet digesting, that's awesome. So as Chuck and I were thinking about, we first started, we set this program up about 5 months ago. And at that time, the vaccination debate was on our minds. And we started to think about what we could do in a kind of really exploring that. And then in January, we started to think more about critical race theory and how that's becoming the very polarizing topic about what can and can't be talked about in terms of race and the discomfort and necessity of having conversations about race. And since then, as we talked a week ago, abortion has become a particular issue. And so that's where we thought we would focus, because that's what was of most significance to Chuck in this time, where he thought he could activate his greatest curiosity in relation to the person that he wanted to talk with. So that's this fluid and emergent, what's a commitment that we have to really where we're most activated in our curiosity. So that's where we thought we would start. So over to you now, Chuck, to take us through your experience.
Absolutely. And so I'm first interested in getting us oriented in our own minds as where they go when you hear the term abortion, right? I find it to be one of those terms that we all feel something about. And so I wonder if anyone cares to share like where their mind goes when they hear that term these days, abortion. You know, you can throw it in the chat room, you can turn your microphone on for a second. And obviously there's no answer that's a wrong answer.
I could probably add something to. So I think what I've been thinking about recently is that I was raised in a with certain expectations that are very different than my adult life has been. So I come from a place of really feeling like I understand one side, and I also now understand another side. And so I think for me, it's yeah, kind of like a heart feeling of I don't demonize, because I've been there and I know people who are sincere in both sides in what they think. So that's just a little something.
Thank you, Shannon. And Scott, you wrote Roe versus Wade in the chat room.
Well, there's a lot of a lot of press on the Supreme Court in the last couple of weeks, and I think it's interesting that it's. I got into a conversation with my partner, which I probably shouldn't have started. But I'd read a really interesting article about that, kind of put things into context around the whole Supreme Court issue, and in that it doesn't necessarily signal the end of women's rights, and so there's an interesting polarization on that issue in itself that I'm kind of curious about. But yeah, I think that there's that sort of lightning rod precedent that is held up. So that's the one that's what comes to mind first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I mean, women's rights is our, at the focal point of this Roe versus Wade conversation, and that entails like what is at stake within that. And just looking at what Marnie said, I think the people that I know that have made the difficult decision to have abortions, I think of my own longing to have children, and I feel tugged. I remember walking past a rally with a loud group on one side of the debate. I remember feeling righteous certainty against them. And my mind goes to that statement that you said earlier, Marnie, that it feels like there's nothing more to be known. Deep down, I think we believe there is more to be known, but it really feels that way because, it's like one of those full stop situations. Someone mentioned, the family dynamics too, when there are different values around us in your family. I think that was you, Colleen, that mentioned, when it feels hard to have these kinds of conversations, and where it could be said that a family is like a microcosm to a society, I think it's very challenging on a societal level. And so living in New York, I think it definitely is a place where there are strong values towards reproductive rights, women's rights, abortion rights. And so with that being said, I felt it important to like have an encounter of persons with someone whose values are pro-life, right? And so we have the clash of positions, pro-life, pro-choice, legalize abortion, ban abortion. And so what I did is I went out and I had a conversation, in my case with a family member, about her own views. And this is a family member who is in fact pro-life. And I guess I created a case study, which I thought it would be useful to share and analyze and reflect on. The guiding question was, how do you feel that you're seen, but also how do you see people whose values don't align with yours in this case? Should I dive into my findings, Marnie? Yeah, okay. So I kind of framed it as an interview, which it was. And so I'll read the leading question, but I'll also read the gist of what the response was. To a degree, it's paraphrased because it was a long conversation. And if I present all of it, we'll be here for a very long time. But I did capture the gist of the responses. And so here we go. You are pro-life. What makes you hold those values? I am pro-life because I believe another life is at stake when a woman is pregnant. And yes, a fetus is a human being. We all have the right to control our body, but most people agree that when your decision is harming yourself or another person, then society has the responsibility to step in. Otherwise, you can make a case that suicide and self-cutting and drug addiction and other acts that people can do to themselves should not be interfered with either. Like those acts, abortion harms someone, the unborn baby in this case. I believe abortion can be a difficult decision to make, but the baby is not at fault when you're trying to figure out what's best. So why take your struggle out on this helpless person? There are also options to help us after the child is born, including adoption. I do think abortion should be allowed when the pregnancy puts the mother's life at risk and when the baby's own viability is at risk. I come from a Catholic family where we believe life begins at conception. It is supported by science, and I put a little disclaimer that says scientists vary on opinions here, but I'll keep going. Not all of us see this issue the same way. In fact, when I was pregnant with my youngest child, many people in my family advised me to consider an abortion for different reasons. I did not. I know so many people with similar stories who went through with it and are happy that they did. I also don't know a person who's had an abortion and doesn't regret it. My close friend, I struck the name, in fact, had a child with rape. It was a very difficult decision for her to keep the child, but in the end, she decided her son was not at fault. My next question was, how do you imagine you are viewed by people with pro-choice values? As a religious fanatic, as a crazy person, like we don't know what we're doing, as someone who wants to have control over other women. They don't look at the moral side of it, and I believe it is a moral issue. My next question, and how do you view people with pro-choice values? People willing to kill humans, but don't realize that. As you know, this is my next question. As you know, much of the country feels strongly about abortion rights. Roe versus Wade may be overturned. How can we as a society come to an agreement on how to decide our future in this? We should talk. We should debate. I think a strong case can be made to prove that life starts at conception. So that's all I captured in the interview. And I would say that my takeaway in this encounter of a person, and in this case an encounter of a family member, is that I think there's a sense of religion and morality that gets intertwined in the debate around it. And I think if we're saying that life begins at conception and thus we have to uphold a ban on abortion, I think a case could be made that we are fashioning this law in accordance to a religion, a dominant religion. And this is, knowing that not all religions believe life begins at conception. So there's that point that that stuck with me once I left this conversation. So yeah, there's my case study.
So Chuck, one of the things that I think is so helpful with the insight approach is that we have the content now, and you've kind of delivered the content. And in terms of the interiority of it, I'm wondering, as you talked and listened, because it was interesting as you reported it, because I couldn't tell what's the level of certainty and what was the level of almost like there's an agility or a flexibility between you and the person that you were speaking with. So what was your sense in both ways, and sort of as from when you started to when you finished?
Hmm. I think my sense was that the person felt that they were, I guess, an outlier in society, in the community. So like there was this disposition of, you know, this isn't my, I know this is an unpopular opinion in my community, but here goes. There was that kind of a sense, I would say.
Hmm. So there was already kind of in the conversation a kind of recognition of threat on like of how they were being seen, and then a kind of a somewhat defensive posture of explaining and kind of a needing to defend that explanation, or that's how the posture kind of when you said sort of I'm an outlier, but here goes. How did that? Yeah.
Yeah, I should also say that um, I'm an outlier, but here goes. But also there was this sense of certainty, um, and this is a certainty of life, of what's defined as life, and when life begins. And so I think that was a big. I think a lot of the passion um, came whenever we were talking about what's considered, human life,
Mhm.
pregnancy.
Hmm. And that was the certainty there about life. That was sort of this. That's
Mhm,
the fact. That's the fact that was sort of not open for negotiation. And
mhm.
when you were talking about that as kind of religious, like the view of a dominant religion, or even, yeah. So what made you feel that it wasn't as certain as your conversation partner was? Where was the gap for you in that certainty?
Well, I, I have my own, views on it, and for me, it centers on uh, um, the ideals of the United States, around freedom of, different things, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, in this case. And I came into the conversation with this belief that abortion is seen as both a moral issue and a religious issue, and um, to the degree that it's seen as a religious issue, I think then the conversation around freedom of religion has to come up, and because if it is a religious issue, uh, that also means that if you don't subscribe to that religion, um, you very well may not agree with what's being said, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I had that in my mind going into the conversation.
Mhm. And so with that fact and that sense, that recognition that there's differences, so like the fact that what did your conversation partner, what did they make of the varying views on life at conception?
Um, I think what came of it was from her was that it's all like there's no like levels of the validity of life at conception, whether it's 4 weeks in, whether it's 28 weeks in, whether it's birth, there's the same value on that life. So um, and so when you hold it that way, um, I think it's easy to see how you would see that as killing,
Mhm.
because it's essentially ending this said life,
Mhm.
started at conception.
And what I'm doing there is just in terms of looking at where there might be possible avenues of curiosity with recognizing like where the certainty was around, okay, so the life at conception and the evidence for that is the religious one. Then when you brought in the sense of like there's different religions that have different views on that, that's for me where there's sort of more variation, there's more flexibility, there's more opportunity to be curious. And that's
Yeah.
where I would then go for like, so what do you make of so depending on one's respect for other religions, what do you make of this varying understanding of life and various stances then in relation to life, given that they're all holy, they're all aiming towards that kind of transcendence or holiness. So that's what the strategy is for me about the what do you make of kind of question is
Mhm.
just be looking at where there might be opportunities to wonder or to reflect or to increase an opportunity for that. So that's where my thinking was going in there. And I'm really interested in others' views on that. But that's where the skill around insight is like, where is there an opportunity for to help or to elicit or to activate other people's curiosities about their own firmly felt beliefs without generating further threat in them as a way of debating, so that listening to understand and then engaging wonder in the gaps that were
Yeah.
noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say that the the point of curiosity lies in the morality versus religion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, I think there was this very firmness that this was a moral issue, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, while that morality entailed like a very particular meaning making
Mm-hmm.
process that other people could define differently, and
Mm-hmm.
so and allow the space for other people to make their own meaning and have that meaning be valid as well,
Mm-hmm.
then it very well may shift from morality to religion, and then to again to freedom of religion. And at least that was how I saw it.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so how did you wonder or in that created space wonder about morality? What was the wondering about morality versus or in relation to religion? That makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, yeah. So my own wondering is, who gets to say whether it's a life or not? Um, because I think there are strong opinions that support both. If you're gonna have two arguments, this is a life, this is not a life. Um, there are many religions who believe, or non-religions who believe, life starts when you take your first breath. And so who's to say that this person is right or that person is right? Um, I'm not to say that that proves right. And so I think the window gets smaller and smaller in this particular conflict, in this particular debate, and we end up having to narrow it down to a very few things, and this is one of them in my mind. That certainly was a takeaway for me. And so um if we can't determine whose meaning is the right meaning, um then we have to at least be willing to hear out the meaning as it's being made. um and while the end goal is not always compromise, this feels like one of those debates where sacrifice must ultimately be made, um, if meaning making won't change.
And so and in some ways, like the sacrifice. So is that so? That becomes sort of part of the question. And it also is like where is the because what we're focusing on in this session is in those spaces of polarizing certainty that also moves towards the options like the deliberating, evaluating, and deciding. And so within you and your family, there may not be the ultimate decisions around whether this should be legal or not, because at that point it's an opinion. But how does it manifest in specific ways within the specific behaviors in your family? And that becomes a very interesting point of given that you and this family member have different points of view, does that how does that how does that work itself out in the dynamics between you?
hmm Well, I think it begins with imagining a world where both views coexist. And I think it's hard to do that, you know, when there's a belief that life is literally at stake. So it is hard to do that, but I think there also needs to be this acceptance of this as one of very many overwhelming dilemmas in our world. You know, it just is, and many overwhelming dilemmas in our world do involve, you know, loss. So it's kind of, you know, it's one where, you know, whatever your view is, there could be a sense of heartbreak that we have to learn to sit with and stir and hopefully evolve in some way. But I don't think I personally don't think anyone has the wisdom to spew the correct answer. Anyone, you know.
So it's one of the things that I think is very useful about insight, as well as the recognition that our knowledge is always provisional until this sort of, because it is an empirical method looking at what is the data of our consciousness rather than in the natural worlds, which is the data of sense. That the sense of that our knowledge is always open for challenge and revision based on another relevant question that emerges. So it really helps me to think about how incomplete my own knowing is and how provisional that can be. So, but once again, your conversation partner might not be of that same belief in the importance of complexity. And so I think with the other polarizing conversation, the other issues that we've talked about, it's also interesting, and this is to open it up to the rest of the group, about what's on your mind in response, where your mind went in response to this conversation. But to think about, so with family members, like around vaccines, what I'm imagining without knowing any of the details is that plays into then decisions about what to do around family gatherings, or what to do with elderly parents, or those kinds of, there's very concrete behavioral ramifications of that. And that's where with you, Chuck, I'm also wondering, like, so does your family just not talk about abortion at the dinner table? Or is there a decision of, I'm going to go out and protest for one way or another, and what makes the protest the best decision? Because it's another part of the being able to assess, like, is this action the best option? What makes it the best option? What is it? Is it the most conscientious thing I can do given this belief? So that becomes then, even if we're not going to then challenge the specific valuing, then it becomes an opportunity to think about, so how do we enact these beliefs in a way that is the most ethical or conscientious? So that was a lot over to pass it over to the rest of the group, but I'm curious, one, what was on your mind as you were listening to this? Two, to think about behaviors in response to polarization. And three, if there's anything else you're kind of wondering about in our last 12 minutes together.
I think that I was, as I was listening and thinking about it, and it kind of came back to me about that whole idea of those situations where there isn't going to be a resolution that is really going to feel complete, and the importance of just being able to hear and listen and acknowledge the other person's view as being valued, I guess, and then a recognition of, just as Chuck said, about how you have to kind of live with that tension of that there isn't going to be a one right answer, and how do you do that when we're, obviously the Supreme Court in the United States is struggling with that. What's the right answer? And, there was one, and now there's going to be a new one, supposedly. So, but I think the recognition of sometimes when we're polarized, we're not gonna resolve the polarization, but how do we accept the values of the person in order to hold them still dear in our hearts?
Thanks, Cam.
May I say something?
Please.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Actually, when you were talking about this case study, I was like, my mind was like moving around in all of the world to try to understand this polarization. Actually, first, I think that if we think to resolve the polarization, is it a good idea? Because polarization helped us during the human history to develop and to transform and to evolve. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can help us to be progressive and to transform ourselves and our communities and our countries. One of the examples can be the polarization around the election. Elections almost in every country in the United States and Canada and all over the world is actually creates a very polarized society during the election, but the outcome is good because at the end of the day, you have an elected government. So this was one thing that I was trying to address. And the second thing was especially about this issue of abortion. I think with this issue are issues of such that can volley our religious thoughts or can like our values, our personal values, our morality, as you mentioned it. It also helped us to evolve because the curiosity and ourselves or in our societies is actually triggered that we should move from uncertainty to certainty and to try to learn more about it and try to understand about the other opinions too. And that actually helped in our maturity.
Yeah. Thank you. And you know, I would say to both points that were made that I think one hard thing about insight in practice is to completely put your arms down and just like listen and you know, there's in practice, there's a need to completely follow someone, you know, where their mind is going, without correcting or disputing, but just like really. And when that happens, it doesn't, you know, as was said, it's not necessarily leading to a resolution, but it very well does open us up to the possibility of some sort of a transformation, if even on a micro level, but perhaps even on a larger level. You know, so I think those incidents happen with my family, where even if we disagree on something, there's enough of an openness to at least be transformed in a tiny way because we're family, and you know, that's not always going to be the case, but I think I'm fortunate enough that there's a little bit of transcendence in the love that exists between family relations. But when that transcendence doesn't exist, it's hard to follow. But it's these like micro shifts that we look for.
It seems like it's like, you know, our hearts are closed when our minds are closed. But when we start to do that little micro dot of transformation, the heart starts to open and then soften, and then we can soften in our human connection and acceptance of each other and our differences.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting that you picked something so intractable because there's sudden, you know, as just watching Marnie go through the steps of the insight and watching her do that, it you know, just shows how difficult this can be if you're trying to get to a answer or a resolution of a complete meeting of minds in order to come to a resolution, even with the magic of insight.
Well, and I think then what the question then becomes, and this is where it isn't sort of necessarily this a meeting of minds, but even an encountering of persons, is that given that we have such differences and there's such a polarizing dynamic, and really polarization is our problem, how can we live with these differences in ways that are just? How do we live with these differences? And so that becomes then the question is, and so that I think then becomes the place where we, you know, as we engage more authentically, it's not to change your mind but you know, to be open to my mind changing. And then where there is not a possibility that has yet been discovered is like, so then what do we do? How do we do this? And that can be then the next useful question. But the relentless curiosity, I think, is really useful to wonder not only about the valuing, but then also about the deciding and what options there are for dignity for all.
Yeah, like you said, Kim, this is something that is in fact intractable, or it certainly it certainly appears that way, and I, you know, that's exactly the kind of issue like we were interested in really exploring. You know, just coming from a place of observing how we function as a society, and how we do address intractable conflicts. It feels like something that's on repeat as far as like you know, positions that are articulated, and then a counter position, and then repeat, right? And so you know, so then lies the question, like, how could that be broken?
And so what I'm wondering in our remaining minute is to just have any takeaways that you're leaving with, so that we have the group sort of ending with anything that came to you as you were sitting in this space thinking about the questions that you came with and what you may walk away with. So to end in that way.
Well, since my mic is still off, I'll go and then let everybody else go. I think it was just a really good reminder of just stay in that curious place and be open for whatever possibilities there could be.
For me, I really appreciated your statement of there may not be a resolution, but there may be a transformation. That's something I'm really going to think about tonight.
Thank you.
I will think about it. That's because Marnie mentioned two things: the valuing, act of valuing and deciding. So I will think about it, that how we can address the issue, polarized issue within society through insight approach. That what are the possibilities to change the valuing and then have an impact on deciding.
Okay, I was going to type it, but it's just going to be quicker to say it. I'm really struck by, and I've been thinking about how to formulate a question or even jump in here, but maybe it's going to take me a couple more weeks to do that. By that notion of identity and how powerful that is in shaping this, and because it's still, I was struck by the comment that others might see me as a religious fanatic, and I see them as killers, even though they might not know it. So that idea that we have almost this, preordained intractability, that in those images, how can that be resolved, right? So that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Chuck.
I want to jump in because it really is now into that where we're moving again in the evolution of the insight approach, but around how important those images are, and that they're narrative images, that they carry a sense of significance with them and a sense of meaning. And they really are very much embedded in that's how our valuing really takes form, even words having valuing. So the words teacher or pedestrian can carry significance with them. So those ones of a religious fanatic or killer are that they carry our valuing and they express them. So thanks for bringing that one. Colleen, is there anything that you want to say?
I think the kind of takeaway for me largely is, well, this I'll spend some time thinking about just in terms of the debate of the topic, but your rephrasing of how do we live with these differences in ways that are just, I think is a nice platform to move forward from for me, and in some conversations of there's no more curiosity. And so it's like, how do we live with these differences in ways that are just in terms of like sustaining a relationship, knowing that there's polarization, and how can that kind of flavor or not flavor interactions.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for showing up. I feel different for having been here with you, and very, very grateful for that. And we will see you on the next round of Insight. Bye for now.
Have a good night, y'all. Okay.
Am I still recording?
I don't see any. Yeah, you are.